Marit Halvorsen crossed the snow to the forge with a loaf in one hand and a ruined axe in the other. The bread was wrapped in a flour sack, still warm. The axe was worn to a sliver, a bit sharpened so many winters there was almost no steel left to it. She had split more cordwood in 2 years than any man on the claim row. She had not come to complain. She had come to trade bread for an edge. And on the bench by the store, the stove agent Harlanquist laughed at her. "A stove's a stove, missus," he said. "You just burn like a spendthrift and blame the iron." 2 winters. 2 children who coughed until the thaw. But when Marit reached the forge, the blacksmith set down his hammer. He did not reach for the axe. He asked her one strange thing. He asked how her bread came out of the oven. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments the coldest winter you ever lived through and the town you watched it from. I want to see how far this fire travels. Now, let me take you back to the start of it. It was the winter of 1875, the second of the grasshopper years. If you know the plains, you know what that means. The hoppers came in the summer like a gray weather of their own, and they ate the wheat down to the dirt, and they ate the leaves off the willows, and some folks said they ate the paint off the wagons. By the time the cold came down, the settlement of Bittern Ford was thin as a shadow. It sat on the line where Minnesota gave up and the Dakota Territory began. A few claim shanties, a store, a forge, and a rail spur the Northern Pacific had laid and half forgotten. Cash was gone. Not scarce. Gone, the store carried folks on credit, and the credit ran long, and everyone owed and no one paid, and that was simply the shape of the place. Marit owed $40 on the store note. $40 might as well have been 40,000. She had come over from Norway 6 years back with a husband and a dream the size of the sky. The husband was buried now, out past the shanty under a cairn of fieldstones, taken by lung fever their first winter on the claim. That left Marit with the land, the note, and 2 children. Anders was 9. Ingeborg was 6, and it left her with the wood. You have to understand about the wood. On the plains there are no forests. There are the cottonwoods and box elders in the river draws, and there is the deadfall a body can drag out of them, and that is all. A homestead ran on wood. You cooked on wood, you heated on wood, you lived or you froze by the woodpile. And Marit had no man to cut hers. So she cut it herself. She walked out to the draw in the gray of the morning. She felled what she could. She limbed it, and bucked it, and hauled it home on a stone boat behind her, and then she split it in the yard with that one axe until her palms cracked and bled and healed into leather. She did this all through the fall. She did it in the snow. And it was never, ever enough. She was 31 years old, and she looked 40. But she held her head up. That is the thing you have to know about Marit Halvorsen before anything else happens. She held her head up. She darned the children's stockings till there was more darn than stocking. She scrubbed the plank floor of that shanty every Saturday with sand and river water until it was pale as bone. And when she went to the forge that day, she did not go to beg. She baked a loaf first. Good bread, or what she thought was good bread. She wrapped it warm in the flour sack. She would trade an honest thing for an honest thing. She would not take charity from any man living. That was her dignity, and it was real, and it was also, though she did not know it, the very thing that had been costing her. Now here is the part she could not see. The stove. The stove had come with the claim. The man who filed before her had bolted it in and moved on to Oregon, and it sat there in the corner of the shanty, a cast-iron air-tight cook stove, a Ridgewell, sold years back by some agent on credit the same as Quist sold them now. It was the only stove Marit had ever cooked on in America. The only one. So she had nothing to weigh it against. She did not know a stove could be right or wrong any more than she knew the sky could be. It simply was. It ate wood the way the plains ate everything, without end and without thanks, and she fed it, and that was that. Her bread came out of that oven pail, and damp on the bottom and scorched black across the top. Every loaf. Every single time. She had learned to cut the burnt part away and give the children the middle. She thought that was how bread was, out here. She thought the plains just took a little off the top of everything. Bread included. She did not know the oven was starving for heat in the wrong places. She did not know the fire was running high and cold and pouring itself straight up the pipe and out into the winter sky, carrying her wood and her labor and her $40 away with it, breath by breath, all winter long. She only knew the woodpile went down like water through a sieve. And she knew the children coughed. Lord, how they coughed. It started in November, the first hard freeze, and it did not stop till spring. A deep, wet, rattling cough, the both of them, worst in the dark hours before dawn when the fire banked low and the cold came seeping up through the floor. Marit would lie awake and listen to it. Anders on his side of the curtain, Ingeborg on hers. That sound. She burned more wood to keep them warm, and still they coughed, and she thought it was just the plains taking its little bit off the top of them too. She thought a great many things were simply the price of the place. She was wrong about nearly all of them. But there was no one to tell her, and no way for her to know, and so she carried it. She carried it the way she carried the wood. Head up, now the axe. By January the axe was finished. She had been putting a stone to it herself, sitting by the fire of an evening, but there is only so much a whetstone can do for a bit that has been ground down to almost nothing. It would not hold an edge past a few strokes. It rode through the wood now instead of biting, bounced and skidded, and once it had skipped off a frozen knot and near taken her shin. She could not fell and buck and split with a dull axe, not with the cold coming and the pile already low. She needed the edge back, and she could not put it there herself, and she had no money for the smith. So she baked the loaf, and she walked the 2 miles into Bittern Ford through the snow, with the bread in one hand and the ruined axe in the other, and she went to the forge. Elias Tarrant kept the forge at the edge of the settlement. He was a big, still man in his 50s, gray coming into his beard. And he did not talk. That was the first thing anyone said about him. Tarrant, he don't talk. He shod the horses and set the wagon tires and mended what was brought to him, and he took his pay in coin, or credit, or bread, or a side of pork, whatever a body had, and he did it all with about 6 words a day. He had come west maybe 4 years back, from somewhere in the east, and no one knew from where exactly because he never said. And behind the smithy there was a single grave with a wooden marker, and the gossips at the store had decided among themselves it was some story of the road, some death on the trail west, and they left it at that. He never fired his own shop stove past a low bank of coals. Folks noticed that too, and thought him miserly with his fuel, and thought no more of it. Marit had been to the forge twice before, both times with her husband, back when she had a husband. Elias had mended a plow point for them once. He had not said 10 words either time. She was a little afraid of him, if she was honest. That stillness. But he was fair, everyone agreed on that, and fairness was what she needed. The forge was warm inside, and dim, and smelled of coal smoke, and hot iron, and quenching oil. Elias was at the anvil when she came in, drawing out something long and thin, and the hammer rang on the steel in a slow, sure rhythm that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. He finished the stroke. He looked up. He did not smile, but he nodded and set the work aside and waited. Marit set the loaf on the bench. She held out the axe. "I have no money," she said. She said it plain. She would not pretend. "But I have bread. Good bread. I baked it this morning." She turned the axe in her hand so the light caught the ruin of the bit. "It's near gone, I know, but if there's any steel left to draw out, if you could put an edge back on it." She swallowed. Here was the sentence she had walked 2 miles to say, and she said it straight, with her chin up. "Could I trade a loaf for the dull axe?" And Elias Tarrant did a strange thing. He took the axe from her. He turned it in his big hands, close to the lamp, and he looked at the bit, and he ran his thumb along it, and Marit waited for him to walk it over to the grindstone. That was what came next. That was the whole of the trade. He did not walk to the grindstone. He stood there, holding her axe, and he looked at it a long moment, and then he looked at her hands, her cracked, split, leather hands. And then he looked at her face, and then he asked her the strangest question she had ever been asked in her life. "How does your bread come out of the oven?" Marit blinked at him. "What?" "The bread." He nodded down at the loaf on the bench, wrapped warm in its flour sack. "This bread. Out of your stove. How does it come out?" She did not understand. What on earth did her bread have to do with her axe? But he had asked plain, and she was an honest woman, so she answered plain. "Pale on the bottom," she said. "Damp, sometimes, and burned on the top. It always burns on the top." She gave a small, tired laugh, the kind you give when a thing has beaten you so long it has almost become funny. "I cut the black off. That's all. The children don't mind." Something moved across Elias Tarrant's face then. It was very quick. If she had not been looking, she would have missed it. It was not surprise. It was more like recognition. Like a man who has been waiting a long time to hear a sound and has finally heard it, far off, and knows exactly what it is. He set the axe down on the bench beside the loaf. Careful. Like it was something that could wait. "Pale on the bottom," he said, half to himself. "Black on the top." Yes, he said nothing for a moment. There was another man in the forge just then, a settler named Osgood, who had come in to fetch a mended trace chain, and he was standing by the door pulling on his mittens, and he had heard the whole of it, and he laughed. Not unkind, just easy. "That's a woman's oven for you," Osgood said. "My missus burns everything black too. Tarrant here, now. He don't even cook. Banks his coals low as a church mouse. You'd think iron cost him gold." He nodded at the little shop stove in the corner, which held only a soft red glow, and he laughed again. "And look there. That grate under it come all the way from some foundry back east. Man carries a fancy grate across the whole country and won't build a fire big enough to warm his hands." He shook his head, friendly, and went out into the snow with his chain. Marit glanced at the shop stove. She saw the grate glowing low beneath it. She saw, without knowing she was seeing it, a raised mark cast into the iron, a maker's stamp, a name and a shape she could not read at that distance. She thought nothing of it, but the question sat in her like a stone. Why had he asked about her bread, and not her axe? Elias wiped his hands slowly on a rag. He looked out the open door of the forge at the white world, at the low sun, judging the light and the hour the way plainsmen do without thinking. Then he did the second strange thing. He reached for his coat. "I'll bring the axe," he said. "And I'll come out. Have a look at that stove of yours." "There's nothing wrong with the stove," Marit said. The words came out of her before she thought about them. "It's the axe I brought you." Elias pulled the coat on. He picked up her ruined axe and slid it through his belt like it was nothing. He banked his own low fire with a few practiced turns of the shovel. "I know what you brought me," he said. And that was all he said. "Now I have to take you back to the store, and to Harlan Quist, because to understand what Elias Tarrant walked out into the snow to do, you have to understand what had happened 3 days before it, on the bench in front of the Bittern Ford store, in front of half the Claim Row. Harlan Quist was an agent for the Ridgewell foundry. He came through twice a year with a wagon full of airtight cook stoves and a book full of credit paper, and he sold stoves to folks who could not pay for them. On terms that ran for years, and he took a commission on every signature. He was a talker. Where Elias Tarrant used 6 words a day, Quist used 600 an hour, and most of them were about himself, or about the fine iron the Ridgewell foundry cast, or about how a man who owned a Ridgewell airtight had joined the modern age and left his neighbors in the dark. He wore a town coat and a watch chain, and he set his stoves fast. He would bolt one in, run a length of pipe up through the roof any which way, collect a mark on a paper, and be 3 claims down the row by dinner. 3 days before Marit walked to the forge, she had come into the store for a twist of thread and a little salt against the note, and she had stood at the counter counting her pennies. And she had said something. She had not meant to say it to anyone in particular. She had just said it, out loud, the way a tired person lets a thought slip. She had said, "I wonder sometimes if there's something wrong with my stove. The way it eats the wood." And Harlan Quist, holding court on the bench by the door with 3 or 4 of the claim row men around him, had heard it. And he had smelled a chance to be clever in front of an audience, which was the thing he loved best in all the world. "Wrong with the stove," he said, loud, and he laughed, and the men around him grinned because he was grinning. "Missus, that stove's a Ridgewell airtight, cast at the finest foundry east of the Mississippi. There is nothing wrong with that stove. There has never been anything wrong with that stove." He leaned back against the store wall. "You want to know why it eats wood? I'll tell you why for free. It's the hand that feeds it. A stove's a stove, missus. You just burn like a spendthrift and blame the iron. My own mother could run a whole winter on what a homestead woman throws up the chimney in a week. God rest her. It's a heavy hand is all. A heavy hand and a light head for figures." The men laughed. They did not laugh cruelly, most of them. It was just the easy laugh of men agreeing with the loudest voice in the room. But Marit stood at the counter with her pennies in her cracked hand, and her face went hot, and then it went cold. And she paid for her thread and her salt, and she walked out past the bench with her chin up and her eyes forward, and she did not say one word, and she walked the 2 miles home through the snow. And she cried where no one could see her, out in the white, where the tears froze on her face before they were halfway down. A heavy hand and a light head for figures. She had lain awake that night and listened to the children cough, and she had believed him. That was the worst of it. She had no reason not to. She had never seen a stove draw right. She had nothing to weigh it against, so she believed the loud man on the bench, because everyone else did, and she added it to the pile of things she carried. "It's my own fault," she thought. "I burn it wrong. I'm wasteful." A better woman would make it last. That is the retention of a lie. It does not just cost you wood. It teaches you to blame yourself for the theft, and that is why, 3 days later, when she went to the forge, she went to trade for an axe. Not to ask about the stove. She had asked about the stove once, out loud, and been laughed at in front of her neighbors for it. She would not make that mistake twice. She would fix the one thing a poor woman could fix. She would put an edge on her axe and cut a little harder and burn a little less and try, one more time, to be a better woman than she was. So you can imagine what went through her as she walked the 2 miles home that day with Elias Tarrant beside her, his long stride slow to match hers, her ruined axe through his belt, saying nothing, coming to look at the stove she had just told him there was nothing wrong with. She was afraid, a little, of being made a fool of again. She almost told him twice to turn back. It was the axe, only the axe. But there was something in the man's silence that was not like Quist's noise at all. Quist filled the air so there was no room for anything but Quist. Elias left the air empty, and in the emptiness Marit found, to her own surprise, that she was not being judged. He walked. He looked at the sky. He looked at the tracks of a fox crossing the trail. He did not look at her like she was a heavy hand and a light head. He did not look at her like anything. He just came. The shanty stood alone on the white claim, a thread of pale smoke leaning off its stovepipe into the wind. Marit felt a flush of shame at the smoke even now, thin and stingy as it was. Even the smoke looked poor. Inside, Anders and Ingeborg were bundled by the stove, the boy whittling, the girl wrapped in a quilt with her cheeks too pink and her breath rattling faintly. They stared at the big silent stranger who ducked through their door. Marit shooed them to the far side of the room, half apologizing, half proud, straightening the already straight things. Elias Tarrant did not look at the children, and he did not look at the clean scrubbed floor, and he did not look at Marit. He looked at the stove. He stood in front of it a long moment with his hat still on, the way another man might stand in front of a horse he was deciding whether to buy. Then he crouched. He opened the firebox door and looked at the fire burning inside it, and Marit saw his face in the light of it, and she saw him reading it. There is no other word. He was reading the fire the way she might read a page. The color of the flame. The way it stood up tall and pale instead of low and blue. The way the heat rushed up and back into the pipe in a hurry to be gone. "Firebox is too deep," he said. He said it quiet, almost to the stove itself. The fuel sits low, and the flame runs high and cold. Heat's got nothing to push against. It runs straight up the pipe before it ever gives itself to the iron. He reached in with the poker, gently, and moved a stick, and watched the flame lean and lick and hurry upward. "You're not burning wood in here, Mrs. You're burning it out there." He tipped his head at the pipe, at the sky beyond it, feeding the winter. Not the room. Marit stood very still. "I told you," she said, and her voice was smaller than she meant it to be. "The stove's not wrong. I'm the one that burns it wrong." Elias Tarrant closed the firebox door. He stood up. For the first time since he had come into her house, he looked at her, and he looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face she could not name. It was not pity. She would have hated pity. It was closer to anger, but the anger was not at her. It was old, and it was banked, and it was pointed somewhere far away, at something that had happened long ago and far off, in another house, in another cold. "No," he said. "You don't." He took off his coat. He hung it on the peg by the door, like a man who meant to stay a while. "Boil me some water," he said, "and keep the young ones back from the iron. I've work to do." He went out to the stone boat and the woodpile and came back in with a heavy roll of tools she had not seen him carry, and he set them on the scrubbed floor, and he knelt down in front of the Ridgewell air-tight cook stove that had come with the house. The only stove she had ever known, the stove that had taken her wood and her labor and her $40 and her children's breath, winter upon winter, without her ever once knowing it was the thief. And he began, without another word of explanation, to take it apart. The children watched from the corner with round eyes. Marit stood by the door, with her hand at her throat. Outside the light was going gold and then gray, the short day folding toward its end. And inside her own shanty, a silent stranger knelt at her cold and hungry stove, with iron tools in his scarred hands, and Marit Halvorsen felt something she had not let herself feel in 2 long winters. She did not have a name for it yet. But it felt faint and frightening and rising, like hope. And she did not yet know if she could afford to let it in. The first fire drew clean and blue. She saw it happen. She was standing by the door, with her hand still at her throat, and she saw the flame catch low in the shortened firebox and lean into the draft, and it did not roar, and it did not smoke. It sat down. It burned steady and small and blue at the root, the way a lamp burns when the wick is trimmed right. Elias Tarrant crouched in front of it with the damper handle between 2 fingers, and he turned it a hair, and the sound of the fire changed. It settled. It stopped fighting the pipe. The room began to warm. Not in an hour. Not by the stove alone. The heat came off the top of the iron and off the sides of it and stayed in the room, the way heat is supposed to. And Marit felt it reach her ankles by the door. She had fed that stove all day, every day, for 2 winters, and she had never once felt it warm the floor. She had thought floors were cold. She had thought that was the plains. He had put maybe 6 splits in it. 6, she counted them going in. Anders came out of the corner first. He was 9, and he had spent 2 winters learning to sit very still and close to the iron, and now he stood in the middle of the room with his mouth open a little, feeling the air. Ingeborg followed him. She was 6, and she coughed, but she coughed less than she had that morning, and she put her small hands out toward the middle of the room where there had never been any warmth to reach for before. "Stay back from it yet," Elias said. "It's hot in a new way. You'll want to learn where." That was all he said. He worked a while longer without speaking. He set the pipe joints and checked the turns he had put in them, 2 clean bends where before the pipe had run straight and dead up through the roof, pulling the cold down the whole time like a hand down a well. He wiped his tools one at a time on a rag from his roll and laid them back in their places. The kettle Marit had filled came up to a boil on the back of the stove while he worked, and it boiled fast, faster than she had ever seen water boil in her own house, and she stood and watched the steam of it and did not understand yet why her eyes stung. Then he did a small thing. He picked up the axe. The ruined axe, worn to a sliver, the thing she had carried 2 miles across the snow that morning. He had never touched it at the forge. He picked it up now, here, in her house, and he set the head against the edge of the hot stove for the heat of it, and he took a small stone from his roll, and in the time it took her kettle to finish its boil, he put an edge back on it. Just like that. The thing she had come to ask for. The whole reason. The trade she had planned and worried over. He did it in the last light by her own stove, as if it were nothing, as if it were the smallest part of the day. He handed it back to her, edge down, the way you hand a person a sharp thing. "There's your edge," he said. She held the axe. She held it, and she looked at the fire, and she looked at the man. And she did not know what to say, so she said the only true thing she had. "What do I owe you?" Elias Tarrant put on his coat. He took his time with the buttons. Then he reached over to the bench where she had left it that morning, and he picked up the loaf of bread in its flour sack, and he tucked it under his arm. "You already paid," he said. "It's good bread." And he went out before dark. She stood in the doorway and watched him cross the yard to the stone boat, a big quiet man going gray. And he did not look back, and he did not explain one thing he had done. He had walked 2 miles out. He had taken her stove to pieces on her floor. He had cut it down and forged it a new grate and hung the pipe over again with proper turns and fitted a damper, and he had done all of it without telling her what any of it meant, or what it had cost her before he came, or why he could not leave it alone. He left her a warm room and 6 splits burning, and a sharp axe, and he took a loaf of bread. That was the trade. The children slept that night without waking to cough. Both of them. All night. Marit lay in the dark and listened for it out of 2 years' habit, and it did not come, and she heard instead the small, steady tick of iron holding its heat, cooling slow, giving back what it had taken, and she did not sleep for a long time, and it was not worry that kept her up. She did not understand it all yet. That came slower. The winter went on. She cut wood the way she always had, because she did not know how to do it any other way, and because a woman who has been cold to the bone for 2 years does not trust a warm room to keep being warm. She cut and split and hauled on her old schedule, the schedule that had always run her pile down to bare ground and frozen dirt by the middle of February, with the worst of the cold still to come. The pile did not run down. It grew. She would come in from the axe with an armful and set it by the stove, and the stove would take 3 splits where it used to eat 9, and the room would hold the heat off those 3 for half a day, and the next morning the pile outside was bigger than the schedule said it should be, not smaller. She kept waiting for it to turn. She had no way to trust it. She had never in her life seen a stove draw right, so she had nothing to set this against, and part of her kept believing the warmth was alone the winter would call back. It was cutting a length one gray afternoon, that she saw the mark. She had the firebox door open to feed it, and the new grate Elias had forged sat there, holding its shallow, bright bed of coals, and something was cast into the iron of it. A stamp. Letters and a small shape she could not read from where she knelt, worn and dark with heat. She had seen a mark like it before. She stood there with a split in her hand, and she chased the memory and found it, the forge, his own shop stove, the low bank of coals he never built up, and under it a grate with a fancy pattern to it, an Eastern thing. A stamp she had not thought about. The same hand had made both. She was sure of it without knowing how she was sure. She did not know what it meant. Not then. She only knew the man had put a piece of his own kind of iron into her house and said nothing. And then, by the tail of the winter, the pile still standing, she finally sat down and did the sum. She was not a woman who did sums out loud. But she did this one. She counted the cords she had not cut. She knew her own arms and her own axe, and she knew what a winter took out of her. And she looked at the pile that should have been gone and was not, and she counted it as near as she could. 4 cords. 4 cords of standing timber she had not had to fell and limb and buck and haul and split, because the stove was keeping the heat now instead of throwing it up the pipe. 4 cords. She sat with that. And then she counted what 4 cords was in her own body, because that was the only coin she had ever paid it in. 11 days. 11 days of her own labor, dawn to dark, the axe and the sled and the frozen wood. 11 days she would have spent and now would not, given back to her out of one afternoon's work by a man who took a loaf of bread for it. And then she counted the money, because there was money in it too, and she had not seen that either. She had a note at the store. $40. She had signed it because cash was gone in the grasshopper years, and credit was the only thing long enough to reach across a winter, and she had lain awake over that $40 more nights than she could name. And she saw now, sitting by the clean fire, that some of that $40 had gone up her own stovepipe, not the store's flour, not the children's shoes. The waste, the wood she would have had to buy, or the labor she would have had to hire when her arms finally gave out, because they would have given out. A woman cannot cut 4 extra cords a winter forever with 2 children to feed and a claim to hold. The stove had been spending her money in a way she never saw. A little every day, up the pipe, and gone. And then she counted the last thing, and it was the thing that broke her. The children had not coughed since the room started holding heat. Not once, hard, the way they used to. She had spent 2 winters listening to Ingeborg cough until the thaw, and telling herself it was the cold, that all children on the plains coughed, that it was the price of the place. And it was not the place, it was the stove. It was the cold room the stove made by throwing its heat away, the cold that had sat in her children's chests 2 winters running, and it had lifted the weak Elias Tarrant knelt on her floor. She had come to him and named the cheapest thing she could think to pay for. She had asked him for an edge on an axe. And he had looked at that axe and read her whole house off it, and he had answered the one thing she could not see. And he had never told her he was doing it. She understood the silence then, too. Because a man who walks into a widow's house and tells her that her home has been wrong for 2 winters, that the coughing was the stove, that the labor was waste, that the money went up the pipe, that man takes something from her. He takes the 2 years back and shows her what they were. He makes her a fool for not knowing, when there was no way on earth she could have known. Elias Tarrant had stood in her house with all of that in his hands, and he had chosen not to hand it to her. He had fixed it and gone home. He had let her come to it herself, slow, in her own time, sitting by her own fire, where it could not shame her. That was the gift. The fix was half of it. The silence was the rest. Spring came the way it comes up there, late and sudden, and with it came 2 things toward her at once. The note came due. $40, payable at the thaw, and she had known it was coming all winter. And Harlan Quist came with it, because Quist worked that store, and Quist knew a widow with a note due, and no cash was exactly the kind of woman who signed a new thing on credit to cover the old. A better stove, maybe. A bigger Ridgewell. More iron. More debt. Another signature. Another commission. He was already talking it when she came in that first thaw morning, holding court on the bench by the stove the way he did, warming himself at an air-tight that ate a quart a week and never once wondered why. She let him talk. She had come to do a thing and she did it. She laid $40 on the counter. In cash. It was quiet money. She did not slap it down. She counted it out in front of the storekeeper. Worn bills and hard coin. $40 she had kept in the house by the simple fact of not spending it on wood she no longer had to buy, and she paid the note in full, and she asked for the paper back, and she folded it and put it away. She did not look at Quist. She asked for nothing. She did not say one word about the stove. But the men on the bench had seen it, and one of them, a Claim Row settler named Osgood, who had picked up a mended trace chain at the forge that same winter and knew how Marit's bread came out and knew Elias kept his own fire low, Osgood was the one who turned on the bench and put the question flat into the middle of the store. "Quist," he said. "Explain me something." Quist smiled his selling smile. "Anything, friend. The Halvorsen woman there." Osgood tipped his head at Marit. "She's got one of your stoves. Come through a full winter, through that blizzard even. Warm on, I'm told, a handful of wood, and paid her note cash out of what she saved." He let that sit. "I got one of your stoves too. Same iron. Eats a quart a week, and I'm cold at the far wall the whole time, and I owe the store yet. Now how's that if a stove's a stove and it's all in the burning?" The store went quiet. Quist's smile stayed up a beat too long. That was the tell. He looked at Marit, and he looked at Osgood, and he reached for the thing he always reached for, the woman's heavy hand, the spendthrift, the fault in the burner and never the iron, and it was not there. It would not come, because Marit Halvorsen was standing there having paid $40 cash out of the exact difference, and the whole store could do that sum as fast as she had, and there was no man in that room now who would believe him. Every house burns different, he tried. The wood, the draft, Osgood said. That's the word. Somebody put right turns in her pipe and cut down her box and give her a proper grate. A real hand did that. And you set mine in an afternoon and never touched the pipe. He turned back to his neighbors on the bench. I'm walking mine out to the forge come Saturday. Have the smith look at it. And that was how it ended for Harlan Quist at Bittern Ford. Not with shouting, not with a lie caught out loud, just a store full of settlers doing arithmetic he could not answer, and one after another walking their stoves out the 2 miles to Elias Tarrant to have the draw put right, and no new signatures on the credit line. And after a season or two, no more reason for a Ridgewell agent to work that country at all. He set stoves fast and never right, and reality was the only witness anyone needed, and reality does not take a bribe and does not forget. The blizzard that Osgood spoke of had come in the deep of that winter, and it was the true test, though Marit had not thought of it as a test while she lived it. It shut the settlement in for 3 days. It was the kind of storm that a year before would have finished her. She knew it while it howled. A year before, that storm would have run her wood down to nothing by the 2nd day, because the old stove burned 9 splits to hold what 3 held now, and she would have burned the last of her pile, and then she would have been standing in a cold, dark room with 2 sick children and a blizzard on the door, and she would have done what women out there did in the last hour. She would have broken up a chair. She would have fed the stool and the bench and the boards off the loft into the firebox to keep breath in her children, and prayed the storm broke before the walls did. That did not happen. The rebuilt stove carried all 3 of them through 3 days on a corner of the woodpile. The room held. The children slept. Ingeborg did not cough. Marit sat through the worst of it, with her hand flat on the warm iron, and understood, in a way the sums had not quite reached her, that the man had not only saved her 4 cords and 11 days and $40, he had, without either of them ever saying it, stood between her children and a night she could not have survived. It was in the thaw after that a traveling drummer stopped at the forge. He was a hardware agent, the real kind, iron and tools and stove parts, and he stopped at Tarrant's shop the way such men stop, and Marit was there. She had walked in with a broken hinge, and she stayed by the door out of the way. The drummer's eye went to the grate under Elias's low shop fire, the fancy one, the eastern one, and it stayed there, and something crossed his face. "Where'd you get that grate?" the drummer said. Elias did not look up from the hinge, made it. "No," the drummer crouched down to it, careful, the way a man looks at something he half remembers. "No, I've seen that pattern. That's a careless cut, that's foundry work, that's a pattern man's hand, that's—" He looked up, he looked at the big quiet gray man at the anvil, and Marit watched the recognition come up in him slow, and go pale at the edges. "You're never Tarrant." Elias Tarrant. Out of the Housatonic works. Elias set the hinge down. "They still talk about the man cut the finest firebox patterns on the seaboard," the drummer said. Quieter now, and then walked off the floor one winter and nobody knew where he went. There was a bad business. A house, his, and the drummer stopped himself, because he had seen something in Elias's face, and he was not a cruel man. He did not finish it. But Marit finished it, standing by the door, because she had seen the wooden grave marker behind the smithy that the gossips of the settlement had always got wrong. Called it a first wife lost on the trail west. Called it whatever a small place calls a quiet man's grief when it does not know. She understood now it was no trail grave. It was a wife and a child, back east, lost in a cold house, in a winter, in a tenement that would not hold its heat, lost by the very fault he now could not walk past in any stove he ever saw again. That was why he had asked her about the bread first, before the axe, before anything. A man who has buried his own family under a bad fire does not see a dull axe when a widow walks in coughing. He sees the fire. He has to. He cannot help it, and he will not say why. The drummer bought nothing and said nothing more, and shook Elias's hand a long time at the door, and drove on. Marit walked home with her mended hinge, and did not tell a soul what she had learned, and that, too, she understood, was a kind of paying him back. 2 winters on from the afternoon he knelt at her floor, Marit Halvorsen had become the woman people quietly sent for. It started with the Nystrom place, a young couple newer to the row than she was, cold at their far wall and burning too much, and the wife pale with a baby coming. Marit heard of it the way you hear of things in a thin settlement, and she thought about it a day, and then she put on her coat and walked out there with nothing in her hands, and asked the young wife a strange question. She asked how their bread came out of the oven. Pale on the bottom, the woman said, surprised, burned on top. Marit knelt at their firebox and opened the door and looked, and she read it the way he had read hers. Too deep. Heat going up the pipe. A grate set wrong. She did not have his hands for iron, not yet, but she had his eye now, and she knew what to look at. And she knew a man 2 miles off who could cut it down and hang the pipe right. She got it done. And when the young wife tried to thank her, tried to make it a large thing, Marit did what he had done. She turned it small. She said it was nothing. She said the bread would come out even now, and let that be all. She did not tell the Nystroms that they had been living in a house that was wrong. She did not hand them the shame of the winters behind them. She fixed the fire, and let them come to it themselves, slow, by their own hearth, where it could not make fools of them. 3 families, over those 2 years. The Nystroms, and the widower down on the flat, with the smoking charter oak, and the big family up the creek with 7 mouths and a stove eating them out of every dollar. Marit went to each one, and knelt at each firebox and read it and got it put right, and to each one she explained nothing about what it had been to live cold and not know why. She had learned that from him. The fix was half. The silence was the rest. The last of it is a small thing. She stood in her own kitchen one evening at the end of it all, the clean blue fire drawing quiet in the good stove, the room holding its heat down to the floor, the children, not so small now, Anders near a man, Ingeborg tall and never coughing, asleep or nearly. And on the wall beside the working stove hung the axe. The same axe. Worn to a sliver 2 winters back, carried 2 miles wrapped in her worry, and sharp now, hung sharp on its peg beside a fire that worked, and it had cut all the wood she needed, and no more since the day he put the edge back on it in the time her kettle took to boil. She had thanked him. Finally, that spring, she had walked to the forge and stood in front of the big gray man and said it plain, all of it, the cords and the days and the $40 and the children's lungs and the blizzard and the things she knew now about the house back east that he would never speak of. She had said thank you for all of it. And Elias Tarrant had turned the hinge or the trace or whatever iron was in his hands that day, and he had not looked up for long, and all he said was the thing he always said. It's still good bread. That was the whole of it. He would not take it larger. He never did. So here is what she carried out of it, and here is what I think it's worth carrying out to you. The smallest fix a person can name is almost never the thing that's actually wrong. Marit walked 2 miles to trade a loaf for an edge on an axe, and the axe was never the problem. The problem was the fire she had no way to see, throwing away her wood and her labor and her money and her children's breath, one day at a time, quiet, up the pipe. It took a man who had lost everything to a cold house to walk in and read the truth off a description of her bread. And it took him the good grace to fix it and say nothing. And the truest thing he gave her was not the warm room. It was that he made her, in the end, into someone who could do the same for somebody else, kneel at a stranger's cold fire, read it, put it right, and never once make them feel the fool for not having known. That's the gift that keeps moving. The one that turns the person who got it into the person who gives it. If you've watched this far, do one thing for me. Comment the coldest winter you ever lived through, and the town you watched it from. I want to see how far this fire travels.